Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Kaffeepause. We regularly check in with Berlin-based journalists to talk about emerging stories and breaking news. And on a very newsworthy day, I am delighted to be joined by Paul-Anton Krüger. He's parliamentary correspondent in the Berlin bureau of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Paul-Anton, herzlich willkommen.
Hallo, vielen Dank.
Well, there is a lot to talk about today, and so I want to, manage our time, but also draw on your expertise and see how much ground we can cover during today's Kaffeepause. I think all of us learned over the weekend that Ukraine's military forces have taken back at least 3,000 square kilometers of territory which had been occupied by the Russians over the course of this month. And it appears as if Ukrainian forces are now about 50 kilometers from the Russian border. The news of Ukraine's successful counteroffensive, which has been aided significantly by Western weapons, is giving credence to the argument that arms shipments from allies can help end the war faster. And this has prompted calls for Western leaders to do more. This is certainly something that Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock heard when she visited Ukraine again over the weekend and was asked about the supply of battle tanks. But it has also reignited the German debate over the export of weapons from Europe. And so I'm turning to you, Paul-Anton, for a sort of nuanced understanding of how this debate is unfolding. Earlier today, the defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, gave a keynote speech at the German Council on Foreign Relations on Germany's new national security strategy. In that speech, she called for the restrictive German rules on arms exports to be relaxed, but she also talked about the fact that Germany could not go it alone and should work together with European and NATO allies to coordinate support. She didn't necessarily talk about Ukraine specifically in this context, but we can only understand her speech against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. So I guess my first question to you is, how is Minister Lambrecht's speech resonating in Germany, in Berlin?
Well, we will have to see because we're still waiting for some of the reactions. But what I can say is that in an exclusive statement to our paper, Robert Habeck, the Minister for Economy, whose ministry is responsible for granting export licenses, pushed back on what she has said in the speech. And also members from the Green Party, leading members, including party chairwoman Ricarda Lang, have pushed back. In the coalition treaty, basically the three parties agreed to have even stricter rules than before, and to also work on the European level to have stricter rules. And apparently Minister Lambrecht felt that she had to make a point regarding European cooperation when it comes to new development of arms projects like the Future Air Combat System that Germany is developing together with France, as well as the main battle tank that is also a joint project with France. And we've been hearing criticism from our European partners for years now that every German screw could basically endanger exports of the final product to third countries. I mean, what we're here talking about is basically third countries. So countries that are not members of NATO or belong to the European Union. And there are other countries like France that have been much more liberal in exporting arms like fighter aircraft to countries like the United Arab Emirates or Egypt or other places.
Mm-hmm. But of course, we have to also understand this as it relates to Ukraine. I mean, one of the things that Lambrecht said in her speech was that quote, our security is being defended in Ukraine. She did say that Germany would continue to provide military support for Kiev against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Again, quote, for as long as it takes. So how do you understand both the broader context of the potential sort of loosening of these restrictive rules, and specifically how this impacts the war in Ukraine?
I mean, Ukraine has been an exception from the rule ever since Germany basically changed course on the export of arms to Ukraine, because previously, basically every German government, whichever color it was, refused to deliver arms to war zones, to active war zones. So there has been a policy change towards Ukraine anyway. The big debate in Germany now is if we should go further, as we have been doing so far, in terms of delivering certain types of weapon systems. The main debate is about main battle tanks, but also APC like the Marder Schützenpanzer, or even the Fuchs, which is basically an armored personal carrier that the Ukrainians have been asking for. The other thing is that, basically Lambrecht mirrored that picture that Chancellor Scholz has used of the Zeitenwende, and basically made the argument that Germany can only strengthen its defense in close cooperation with European partners. I mean, it's clear to everybody that there's not going to be a sixth-generation fighter jet developed by a single European country, be it France, be it Britain, or be it Germany. So the only way to shoulder those major projects is European cooperation. And then the question that you have to answer if you start a project like this is, how do you finance the billions in R&D costs that run up long before you can use the product yourself, or can export it to other countries? And if you look at the limited European market and the cross-section between EU membership and NATO membership, you see, okay, if you restrict it to those two groups of countries, you have a customer base of about 35 countries. If you add some countries like Japan, South Korea, or other democracies like Australia, you can probably broaden it up to 40, 45 countries. But many of them already buy comparable gear from the US. So there's a limited market. And so you'll have to see how you can refinance those projects. And that's basically the shift that she has been calling for now in the European or in the German debate.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I thought was interesting in her remarks is she talked about the Zeitenwende having to take place in people's heads and not just in the wallet, so to say. And you talked a little bit about the fact that both Robert Habeck and Ricarda Lang from the Green Party had sort of pushed back against some of the things that she had said in her speech. And one of the questions that I had was, how much was this speech intended to deal with some of the divisions within the governing coalition, both within the SPD, and Lambrecht is a member of the Social Democrats, but also within the governing coalition as a whole, and also to really sort of provide some Rückendeckung, to provide some support for Chancellor Olaf Scholz?
I would be astonished if she didn't have a conversation about that part of the speech with the Chancellor before she gave it. I mean, this is pretty far-ranging and is also kind of probably not completely against the coalition treaty, but certainly going in a different direction, right? The coalition treaty was supposed to further limit German arms exports to third countries. Mm-hmm. A more restrictive line. That is what basically the Greens and the left wing of SPD has been asking for. And already under the previous government, Rolf Mützenich, the faction leader in the parliament, managed to get a clause into the previous coalition treaty that was taken up by this one again, that there is no arms deliveries from Germany to any of the countries directly involved in the Yemen war. which at the time was not only Saudi Arabia, but also Egypt and the UAE. The latter countries would probably today claim that they are not directly involved in the war in Yemen anymore. But also when it comes to other conflict scenarios. I mean, Baerbock, without knowing her position on this, but has made the point in several public remarks recently that whenever she talks to a colleague from an African country or an Asian country and asks them for support for the Western position towards Russia, for example, in the upcoming UN General Assembly, the feedback is, okay, but you ask us to vote against Russia, but you're refusing to sell us a couple of helicopters that we need for whatever purposes. Mm-hmm. And so we end up buying from the Russians because we have no other choice, right? So at least she has been pointing towards that dilemma without me knowing her position on what Lambrecht has said today.
Mm-hmm. Let's maybe hone in on providing support for Ukraine, because there seem to be some interesting debates going on and some interesting voices in all of this. Norbert Röttgen from the opposition Christian Democratic Party, former chair of the Bundestag's Foreign Relations Committee, tweeted that Ukraine needs more weapons now. And he also pointed out that some German Marder and Fox tanks are ready for delivery. Omid Nouripur, the co-chair of the Green Party, was suggesting a Ringtausch, right, or weapons swap to try to make some equipment available. And of course, in the FDP, Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann has been pretty outspoken about providing support for Ukraine. So how do you see this debate unfolding, specifically about Germany's ability to provide more support to Ukraine in light of Lambrecht's speech saying that we need to do more with our European allies and counterparts?
Well, Lambrecht somehow announced that in her speech too, because she basically said that the Bundeswehr basically doesn't have anything left that they could deliver to Ukraine. And when it comes to the main battle tanks, the famous Leopard, the question is where could they source them from, right? Mm-hmm. I think there is new dynamic in that debate in several ways. I mean, first, the Ukrainian successes on the northeastern front show that military equipment from the West makes a difference. And it was acknowledged today by the Chancellor and also by the Foreign Minister when she visited Kiev over the weekend, right? So there's no debate about that. Question is, what types of weapons do they need? I mean, Chancellor Scholz again made the point today when Israeli Prime Minister Lapid was visiting that Germany is already doing a lot. So there's air defense tanks, Cheetah, that apparently played a role in the offensive. That's at least what we're hearing from sources on the ground. There's another air defense system, Iris-T, that even the German Bundeswehr does not have in operation. There was supposed to be a system delivered to Egypt, and basically German government managed to convince Egypt that this could be used to send it to Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. So they have to wait longer for the system that they have ordered. But I mean, Ukraine has been constantly asking for armored vehicles, and rightfully so, as US Defense Minister Lloyd Austin recently said after the meeting of the Ukraine contact group in Ramstein. And there is tanks that belong to the German industry that are not in use by the Bundeswehr that could be pretty quickly delivered to Ukraine. And Chancellor Scholz so far has refused to do so. And the reason he is mentioning is that Germany is not going to do any Alleingänge, so it's not going to do it alone, but only together with the allies. And he's always pointing to that op-ed that President Joe Biden put out in the New York Times, where he basically put out the principles of the U.S. support, weapon support for Ukraine. The question is if that is still tenable. What we're hearing is that there is a debate in the U.S. government as well, if the military development in the Ukraine requires the US to deliver weapon systems that it hasn't delivered yet. And the other question would be, if Scholz always claims that he's not going to walk alone for that, would the US reject any efforts by Europeans to send that type of weapon systems to Ukraine? There was a clear rejection when Poland suggested earlier in the war to deliver MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. That was basically shot down by the US. But I would doubt that they have the same type of reservations if Germany would go, especially for the 100 Marder, which is it's not an APC because it's a real tank, right? It's a 40-ton vehicle. It's much more heavily armored than, for example, the American MRAPs that have been sent to Ukraine. Whereas, for example, Fox tanks would be a lighter system than the MRAPs, I would suggest. Mm-hmm. So there's dynamics in that debate now.
Yeah, and it's incredibly timely, right? I mean, you mentioned the meeting in Ramstein and some of the statements by U.S. Defense Secretary Austin. I mean, this was just 4 days ago that senior defense officials from about 50 countries met in Ramstein. And at that meeting, it seemed as if the U.S. delegation was suggesting that the United States might be ready to send more modern tanks to Ukraine. And of course, this would create added pressure for Germany to follow suit. On the heels of the Ramstein meeting, the US ambassador in Berlin, Amy Gutmann, gave her first major television interview on ZDF. And she indicated that she welcomes and is impressed by everything that Germany has done so far. But she also said that there are greater expectations of what Germany can and should do. And she went so far as to say that Germany should really take on a greater leadership role in addressing this challenge. So how do you see this sort of interplay between Washington and Berlin right now when it comes to the delivery of weapons?
Yeah, I would say if the US takes the lead again, probably the German government would follow without much hesitation, right? The thing is that apparently Chancellor Scholz doesn't want to expose Germany too much. I mean, there's a political dynamic, I think now that here in Berlin that could lead to a change of the position in the end. I mean, it's well known that there are members in all three coalition factions who would support the delivery of main battle tanks. You mentioned Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, who's the head of the Defense Committee in the Bundestag. There is well known some politicians from the Green Party, so Toni Hofreiter. I don't know when it comes to battle tanks what Habeck's position would be, because he has not spelled it out publicly. But both party heads of the Green Party have been calling over the weekend and today to do more, even beyond the Ringtausch, and that only can mean direct deliveries, right? You have people in the SPD, like the head of the Foreign Committee, Michael Roth, who has been advocating for this. So there's mounting pressure. And there's encouragement to take the lead. And I think one of the major arguments that probably has not been spelled out publicly so much, but that factored into the considerations of the German government is that until recently, there was still gas flowing through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, allowing us to stock up for the winter. And I mean, Russia has now cut that flow back to a minimum. and it's not clear if it's ever going to come back to levels that are in the bilateral treaties with Russia, or levels that used to be the norm before the war, right? So this is an argument that probably is kind of fading somehow from the debate. Mm-hmm. The other one that Scholz has publicly made is the fear for military escalation on a level where that would become a war between NATO and Russia, basically.
I mean, this question around military escalation is a really good one, because I'm thinking not just about the recent statements by the US ambassador in Berlin, but over the weekend there was also an interview conducted in a Russian publication with the Russian ambassador in Berlin. And in that interview, he voiced criticism against Germany because of its delivery of weapons to Ukraine, and said that Berlin has crossed a red line. And so I'd be curious to know how sort of the Berlin bubble is dealing with these statements by these two ambassadors.
Well, I mean, the Russian position is somehow reflected from the left party and the AfD in the Bundestag, but more when it comes to the sanctions, mm-hmm. And less when it comes to the support of Ukraine by weapons delivery. There is a certain fear, I would say, in Germany and also in some political circles that Putin might go crazy, or whatever you want to call it, right? So take sharply escalatory steps to turn the war in a better direction. And there are elements in the Russian military strategy and also in the Russian nuclear strategy that refer to that, right? So that Russia, when it comes to a real serious situation for their national security, if the existence of the country would be at play, they would resort to the use of nuclear weapons. And we all know that Russia has invested quite a lot in the recent couple of years into tactical nuclear weapons that could be used on the European battlefield. Mm-hmm. So there is a fear. On the other hand, I mean, Putin's tactic has always been playing to that fears, especially in Germany, right? To cut off the gas flow, which he basically did finally, but also to kind of escalate the whole conflict in a military sense. When it comes to nuclear weapons, I'm not so sure that this is a very solid argument, because, I mean, first, what you could achieve militarily by using tactical nuclear weapons is not clear to me. And certainly the whole context of the conflict would totally change, right? Mm-hmm. I cannot imagine Russia coming back to the international community as a responsible player after having used nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine. I cannot see this, and it would put immense pressure on countries that so far have been supporting or have been neutral towards the Russian aggression on Ukraine. China, not the least one, that would have to reconsider its position, right?
So related to this, and maybe coming back to the Lambrecht speech to a certain degree, there has been a lot of interest in this new national security strategy that the German government is putting together, and which is slated to be released before the end of the year, along with a China strategy as well. What are you able to tell us about this new national security strategy that's being crafted?
It's a drafting process that is underway with input from a lot of ministries in the government and also from the Chancellery. It has been debated at the Meseberg cabinet meeting. It's drafted under the foreign ministry, which is kind of interesting to see. I think it's basically a leftover from the times before the war, because if you look at other major European democracies or the US, this is usually something that is done in the prime minister's office, in the president's office. In the US, it's a process that is conducted in the National Security Council. In France, it's done by the presidency. So, I mean, it's kind of bizarre that it's located in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's the first time that Germany is going through such a process. There has been something that amounted to a national security strategy, which has been the famous White Book. Again, there the political chapter had been drafted in the foreign ministry, and the remainder, the military conclusions, have been drafted in the Ministry of Defense. This time, this is supposed to be a whole government effort, which I think makes perfect sense. There has been public outreach on this process. So Annalena Baerbock toured the country over the summer and held town hall meetings and public debates about that, because she feels that people have to kind of get a better understanding what security is all about. It's gonna be, from my understanding, a pretty broad understanding of security that's gonna feature in that strategy. So it's gonna entail climate change and other threats to national security that don't pertain necessarily to what we would consider to be hard security, military security, right? Mm-hmm. I think the drafting process is supposed to come to an end by the end of this year. So it's going to be released by the end of the year, early next year, and comes together with the China strategy that is still in an earlier phase of the drafting process. But that's going to be a blueprint for our relationship with China. And it's remarkable that in the coalition treaty, language is quite different from what the previous government thought about the relationship with China. It has become much more critical, and I think it's going to be reflected in the China strategy.
One of our viewers is curious about how both the German political scene, but also how the German media discusses or is considering the risk that China might attack Taiwan, similar to Russia's attack on Ukraine, and what the reaction would be, could be, should be to such an act of aggression by China against Taiwan. To what degree is that being discussed at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's an immediate concern, right? But it's certainly a scenario that has to be factored into those discussions, how you further deal with China. Because, I mean, there's also a dependency on China in an economic sense. It's not comparable to the dependency on Russia because it's both-sided. It's like with the US and the China relationship. Annalena Baerbock has made a remark when she visited the NPT review conference in New York, where she basically was asked about the Pelosi trip to Taiwan and how she's reacting towards it. And she basically said that as a rule, large countries or powerful countries should not be allowed to intimidate or coerce their smaller neighbors. Mm-hmm. And she made a comparison to what Russia is doing to Ukraine, which set up the Chinese quite a bit. So the German ambassador to China had her first visit to the foreign ministry the next day. And I think, if I remember correctly, she tweeted she had a very open and frank conversation. So the Chinese were pretty upset about that comparison because, I mean, the legal aspects are quite different, right? I mean, Germany, as the US, is supporting a one China policy, and it's simply not comparable, right? When you look at the longer range, I think it has to be of concern for Europe because we see a buildup in China, especially when it comes to nuclear forces. So they're building 2 new fields of silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles. These only make sense with nuclear warheads on them. And also, if you look at other parts of the military development in China, right? I mean, aircraft carriers, attack aircraft that are obviously designed to cause problems for US carrier groups. Certain types of missiles that are supposed to be nuclear tipped that are apparently for the same purpose. So I think this is something that you'll have to keep in mind when you're drawing up a China strategy. And there is a change also in the mood towards China. Also in the German economy, it's not that much driven by considerations about Taiwan, but simply by the COVID or anti-COVID policy that China is following, that is basically damaging business ties with China and causing all sorts of problems for German companies that are invested in China and producing in China, because you simply cannot send people there. People who are working there are trying to leave. So this relationship has come under stress from various angles.
Well, I for one will certainly be interested in seeing what this China strategy looks like, because
me too, would be a good scoop.
Over the past few months, as we've had visitors here in New York, I have been asking pretty consistently, in light of what's going on in Ukraine and recognition that Wandel durch Handel has not really worked or is not suitable today in the 21st century. I've asked if one is also drawing lessons when it comes to China politik, right? We've seen a change in the Russland politik or in the Russia policy. To what degree are politicians and even the business community changing their policies toward China? And the responses have been interesting. Some people have said, no, we haven't really started thinking about that yet. Others have said, yes, we are thinking about the implications of this for China. And so hopefully there will be some guidelines, some interesting information when it comes to this this China strategy. But Paul-Anton, I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about a couple of domestic policy issues that have been interesting to follow over the past few days and weeks, and also hone in on some individuals. One person who we touched on earlier in our conversation is Robert Habeck. He, together with Annalena Baerbock, seem to be the most popular German politicians at the moment, sort of eclipsing Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, in their popularity. But it seems almost as if Habeck is losing some steam in terms of his attraction. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where things stand for Habeck, some of the challenges that he's been dealing with in his role, particularly as economics minister and minister of energy policy?
Yeah, he's probably in one of the toughest spots in German policy making where he can be currently, right? I mean, because the major issue that is gonna come up over the winter is energy security, both in terms of gas, where we have a fatal dependency on Russia. That has been going quite well in terms of securing supplies, but I mean, prices are skyrocketing. So we hear from people who have been paying 150 or 200 euros per month for the gas bill, that they're now supposed to pay 3, 5, or 10-fold the same amount. And the second problem that is directly connected to that is energy, right? Because in the German or European system, European energy market, the most expensive producer dictate the price, right? So even if the costs to producing electricity from coal or even nuclear have not risen, the energy companies can sell it to a higher price because the most expensive power plants in the market are currently gas power plants. And because there's a problem with some other European countries, I mean, France has turned off about 20 or even 30 of the 50 nuclear reactors. So we're currently supplying France with additional electricity. This is kind of a challenge for the whole European market. And there has been technical hiccups in what is called the Gasumlage in Germany, which was supposed to stabilize gas importing countries that suffer from the fact that they have to purchase gas on the world market at much higher prices than they were supposed to get from Russia. And you can also see some utilities, so electricity producing companies coming into trouble. And if you look at the German structure, you often have your local Stadtwerke, so suppliers that belong to the municipalities that are directly coming into trouble now, right?
Yeah.
And paying for the energy bills will be the biggest thing. It's being addressed by the third Entlastungspaket, which is 65 billion, so twice the sum that the two previous were together. Yeah. Which shows that the government is taking this very seriously. And yeah, Habeck is coming under pressure because he's responsible for energy supply.
Yeah, this new relief package was just announced, I guess, a little bit over a week ago, not this past weekend, but the weekend before. Of course, the devil is in the details in terms of how it's going to be implemented, but it looks as if some relief is possible. And of course, it will be a Dauerthema, right? I mean, a constant theme this fall as the temperatures sink and as energy prices go up, exactly how both businesses but also individuals cover the cost of energy.
Yeah, especially small and medium enterprises, right? I mean, this is going to become a big problem because most of the large corporations have either ways to switch, for example, from gas to oil, or have a better chance to withstand the external shock than small and medium enterprises. But as we all know, I mean, this is the backbone of German economy, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So related to the German economy, I'd like to maybe sort of cross the aisle, if you will, and talk a little bit about the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats. They just had their party conference in Hanover, and it was interesting to see that there were maybe a couple of new positions that were taken, a couple of new accents that were set, but there had really been high hopes of sort of groundbreaking social policies and economic policies under the leadership of Friedrich Merz. And we didn't really see that much in this regard. Can you talk a little bit about the party conference and Friedrich Merz's standing as the new leader of the CDU?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the main topic that was controversial there probably was the Frauenquote. And it was, I mean, we heard from party circles that it would not be 100% that he would get his will. He finally did. He's taking criticism from the more conservative circles in the party and more conservative segments of the German population for that. He harshly criticized Chancellor Scholz during the budget debate in the Bundestag, which led to Scholz basically putting his manuscript for the speech aside and basically getting back to Merz and trying to prove him wrong. There has not been that much, I mean, and I don't know if there's much else you can do, right? I mean, basically the criticism was that a lot of companies do not profit from the third package, that businesses are probably going to go bankrupt and that the government has to do more, but he doesn't have the magic key to solve those problems either. But if you look at the polls, I mean, they're clearly in the lead when you look at the federal level. Will be interesting how things play out in Lower Saxony, where they're going to have a state election on 8th of October. because some of the topics that we've been touching upon are very sensitive there. For example, when it comes to nuclear energy, the resistance against nuclear energy had a base in Lower Saxony. They have the most modern nuclear power plant that still is on the net. The Greens or Habeck decided to keep 2 in reserve and is giving technical reasons for that, because they are in the southern part of Germany where you don't have as much wind power as we have in the north. But this is going to be a prism which is going to crystallize a couple of debates that we're currently having. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because the Social Democratic Prime Minister, Mr. Weil, is quite popular, and it was taken as granted that he would win in re-election. Current polls clearly see him in front, but the CDU is closing in, and will be interesting weeks to go.
It will certainly be interesting to see how that state election goes, and to what degree it's sort of a bellwether for national politics as well.
Also, because it might again be a heavy loss for the Liberals, right, who have already suffered defeats in 3 elections this year.
Yes, and so that will be very telling for Christian Lindner and his future. But then also, of course, it remains to be seen how well the Social Democrats do in Lower Saxony. So Paul-Anton, I'd like to maybe end our conversation today where we began, namely in the area of foreign policy. Today's Kaffeepause is taking place a little bit later than we usually have our Kaffeepause, because you had to be at an event earlier today in the Foreign Office that focused on feminist foreign policy. And so I'd be curious to know from you whether in the speech that was given by Annalena Baerbock or in other conference proceedings, you were able to get a better understanding of what is meant by feminist foreign policy as it's understood by the Foreign Office at the moment, and how that might shape the foreign policy view of Germany in the months and years to come.
Yeah, it's certainly something that Annalena Baerbock is coming back to regularly, right? I mean, there's no trip that you take with her where she doesn't have an item on the agenda that refers to that, be it to visit. I mean, one of the first trips before the war, when we went to Ukraine, she went to see women close to Mariupol and the border region at the time, and basically asking them for the problems that they were suffering from because of the conflict, right? And I mean, she has some of the science behind her. If you look at conflict studies, it's pretty clear, there's pretty clear evidence that if women are properly involved in peace negotiations and stuff like that, they are more sustainable, often more successful. She has been making that point when it comes to climate change, because often the livelihoods of women are more affected than those of men. She has made that point when it comes to Afghanistan, where women are subdued again by the Taliban, girls not allowed to attend school, things like that. So, I mean, it's one of the things that she always has in mind, whatever she does. And we certainly going to see that factored into the national security strategy.
Well, Paul-Anton Krüger, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's always good to talk to you. I learn something every time we get together. So I want to thank you again for making this Kaffeepause possible and for having this discussion.
It was my pleasure, and sorry for letting you wait. I hope you enjoyed your late coffee or tea or whatever you had.
Yeah, it was well worth it. It was well worth organizing this a little bit later than usual in order to benefit from your insights. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the week.
Most welcome. Thank you.